So I recently released a very big sample pack full of drums, meaning that now is a great time to talk about how I use them and also how I synthesize them. Now here we are in the example project. This is actually a project that I started working on after I got back from Burning Mountain. So there's a lot of things that I learned while I was at the festival, obviously hearing a lot of music. And one of the things that I learned was that I was fundamentally wrong about how I would arrange my drums. To be honest, not so much the resulting drums that I had, but actually the way that I was thinking about it, in the sense of building it up and how I should place my drums with respect to the energy level of the particular section. So I'm just quickly going to play this part of the track here, this little drop here, so that you have an idea of what the drums sound like, and then we'll also listen to it without any of the other elements, so you'll have kick, bass and the drums. But for now, let's hear the whole track. So hopefully you can hear that it's a little bit more complex than the usual drum loops that I like to use. So now let's have a look in what it actually is made out of. So going into this group here, we obviously have the kick. I've already made individual videos on kick synthesis, as well as a whole bunch of other things in relation to the kick itself. The only thing that I'll have to say for this one is that the kick was specifically chosen for the BPM. As you can see, it has the same BPM as the project BPM here. And that means that it's perfectly aligned with half part of the beat. Now for those that follow my bassline videos, they will know that my bassline only produces a sub bass in the second half here. This note that sits here does not actually produce a sub bass, so it's not going to clash with the sub bass of the kick itself, and it allows me to phase align just this part to the sub bass of the kick. And then for this segment here, the sub bass is obviously provided by the bassline and not by the kick. Now within the drum pack, you'll find that there's 6 different BPMs that you can choose from, and obviously for each one of these, they're going to be specifically for that BPM, and you can also see that I've included a key. This is not actually the key of the sample as it was made. This is the key of what bassline I would use together with the kick. I like to tune my kicks 1 or 2 semitones below the bass note. So that means that this kick, even though it's labeled as A sharp, is probably actually hitting G sharp towards the end of the tail here. Again, I've talked about kick tuning in particular in a different video, so I'll link that one in some kind of cards or in the description or something like that. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out. And I'll talk about all of the reasons why I actually do this. So now we'll look into the other drums, and we start off with the hats. This is my main hat group here, and it just features one closed hat and an open hat. This is nothing complicated. Together they sound like this. So you can hear it's very repetitive and it gets boring very quickly. This is what I would usually use as all of my kind of top loop hats and top loop excitement in terms of the drums. One of the things that I keep forgetting about was to add a little bit of extra texture to it. And in this particular project, the way that I've done that is through a couple of things. We first have this loop. Again, this has a little bit of a repetition, but it has a repetition of 1 bar. Now, another thing that I've added just to, again, increase the interest a little bit is a hat sound like this. You can hear that it's the same hat, but pitched differently. There's a 3 semitone difference in the pitch here. This one is 2 semitones above the original sample, and this is 1 semitone below. And then the final element to add interest is a percussion loop like this. You can hear that it doesn't really have an actual rhythm within the 2 bars in which it repeats, but it does have this repeating feeling, which just adds a little bit of extra stability to it. So all of these extra texture elements together just sounds like this. So these are all of the drums that I just use for added texture. They're not meant to be the main drums. They're just there to add a little bit of extra interest over time. Make sure that one part of the drum sounds just a little bit different than another part of the drums. Finally, the other main drum that we need is a snare. And in this case, what I did is layer 3 different snares. As you can see, here's the first one. This is removing a little bit of the high end here, as well as here. And then on this last one, we do have the extra high end added in. So this is solely responsible for that crispiness, whereas these other two add a little bit of extra medium high range to the snare. Finally, we have the total processing, and you can see that fundamental that was present in here is actually removed when it gets to this point here. And then obviously all of this is used to glue it all together. In particular, what I'm doing here with this compressor is a little bit of parallel compression, very strong compression. You can see a very low threshold, but you can see the very slow attack. We're essentially letting just more than the transient through. It's not just the transient itself, this is making the snare very, very dynamic. If you hear it without it, it sounds a little bit more flat, and you can hear that it sounds very much more sustained. We also have a clipper to make sure that we're not going too hard. As you can see, I am pushing it in there and then reducing the output again. So we are actually clipping off the loudest part of the transient here. Finally, we have a crash here, and there's actually a couple of crashes within this track here. You can see some other crashes that we're using here as well. These are specifically for the build-up. But this is my main crash, and the whole goal of this is, again, just to add a little bit of extra excitement to certain parts. In this case, what it's doing is it's adding a little bit of splash anytime there's a little bit of an impact. So for those that have seen my video on energy flows, they know that we have a low energy flow here, a medium energy flow here, then we get kind of almost to the highest energy level. I would consider this a high energy level portion of the track, but we don't yet have the offbeat hi-hat here. So we'll get to that offbeat hi-hat in a little bit. What is now interesting to note in particular for the crashes, that you can see that with the energy level increasing, the amount of crashes that are happening is increasing here. And you can ignore this part because this is part of some kind of buildup in the fill there. It's not actually part of indicating the energy level here. You can just see that both of these two sections have the same energy level if you're just purely looking at the crashes. So now for the open hat, let's have a look into that. And this is what it sounds like. This one is nice and snappy. The way that I achieve that is with a transient shaper, which just adds a little bit of attack and then a little bit of pump. Gives it a very nice dynamic feeling. So I already talked about the kick being part of the sample pack. In fact, actually all of these samples that I've just played, with exception of this loop here, is part of the sample pack. So the hats that you heard, all of the hats that you heard in here, these are actually consolidated, but they are part of the sample pack originally. We have all three of the snares being part of the sample pack. You can see the different layers. We have 2 snares and a clap. And then for the percussions, I'm using a drum rack, which is just loaded up with percussions from the percussion section here. I did take all of these individual percussions and tune them differently to make sure that they all work with the key of the track. As you can see, some of them are tuned up. This one is actually in a different mode because I'm playing with the attack, decay, and release here. But again, you can see this is being tuned separately. And then the only one that I did not have to tune was this first one because it's already in A sharp, and that means that it works perfectly with the key of the track. The final little trick that I want to show you is this cool contraption here that I made with this dry wet rack here. If you look at the wet part, you can see that I have a utility and an LFO. We're using this LFO to generate a random signal in 16 notes, and you can see that it's assigned to the balance here, so to the left-right panning, and we've just set the limit of 25 to 75% so it doesn't go hard left or hard right. Here you can see what the dry wet rack is doing in terms of when it's active. You can see that it's only playing in the medium energy level, and with the high energy level I want all of the hats to again be very, very powerful, very, very energetic, so we're not doing any panning there. But you can hear what kind of spatial effect that gives if I play it soloed. Now, before we get into drum synthesis, I do want to say that if you're new here and you want to support the channel, make sure that you're subscribed and that you like the video. Also, you can support me financially by going to my Gumroad page and checking out all of the products that I sell there. Now, I'm currently running a summer sale, so with the code SUMMERSALE23, you will get 30% off everything that you buy. And there's no limit on this. However much that you decide to spend, you will just get 30% off of everything. But that's only running until July 24th, so make sure that you get there very, very soon if you're actually interested in buying something. With that being said, let's get back into the video. So now let's quickly have a look at drum synthesis. As you can see, I have a serum setup here. And then we have an audio track. I just want this to take the audio output from Serum so that we're able to record that. And we're going to start with a clap because that's by far the easiest one to do. What you want to do is you want to find some noise. In this case, I'm going to go with the bright white because I like the high frequency content that it has. It is obviously very bright and has a lot of high frequencies. And the way that we want to do this is we essentially want to make a few spikes and then a tail. So for those that don't know what a clap looks like, you're drawing in something that looks like this, where you have a few like this. And then we'll go with maybe a shape that looks like this for now. We can fine tune this later, but let's have a listen to what that sounds like. You can hear that that's the starting point for our clap. Now, obviously, with creating samples, there's a lot of things that you can do. I'm just going to go through a standard kind of processing chain of how you would do that. I'm going to start off with an EQ here. We'll remove all of the frequencies that we don't really need. I'm going to go like this. It would be nice to have it a little bit snappier, so I'm actually going to shape this forward even more so that's even closer still. And then maybe we'll make a shape that looks somewhat like this. Let's give it a little bit of extra release timing like this. You can almost think of it as like a body and then finally a release here. And we can add a little bit of stereo width if we want with the dimension. I don't like to use the hyper here, just a little bit of dimension is nice. And to make it a bit more interesting, I'm going to turn on the reverb and I'm going to make a shape like this. This essentially means that the transient is not going to have any reverb, but the reverb is going to come in and then kind of wash out the sound because we assign this to the mix. We want to turn off our high cut and we want to turn up our low cut because we obviously want a lot of high frequencies being a clap. Let's tighten this clap a little bit by making it lower here, making it earlier. And now we can start to do the processing. So for example, we can use a little bit of dynamics here. I'm going to start by setting my attack to 0 and then I'll set my threshold and ratio. Now this makes it sound very flat because we're obviously instantly snapping the compressor down. So we're just going to give it attack until we find the spot that sounds actually nice. Final thing that you can do to make it a little bit snappier and a little bit stronger again at the transient is to add a little bit of gain here at a higher frequency. Let's go with like 8K. I'll actually set it like this so that we can set our modulation as so. And then assign that like this. Maybe a little bit less. And you can hear that that brightens up the transient a bit more while making the sustain a little bit darker. Now, obviously, these are just some of the things that you can do to the sound design. There's a whole bunch of other processes that you can use. I'm not going to go over all of the potential processes that you can use. I just want to give you an idea of how to get started. But once you do have a clap that you like, what you can do is just make a MIDI clip that is 1 beat long. And then you just record whatever you have. And now this is a sample. The fun part about this being a sample is that if you want to, you can edit it further still. So for example, here, if I want this to be like this short and I want it to ring out a little bit quicker, I could, for example, do something like this. And now I have an even snappier kind of clap. I can consolidate this to create a new file, and now this new file can be saved in a folder or used in a track. So now let's move on to a snare. A snare is very, very similar. The only real difference is that it has a very low kind of fundamental frequency in there as well, which we're just going to emulate with a sine wave. We want to use the first LFO to set the tone of the sine wave here. So there is going to be a little bit of pitching involved on the sine wave itself. And then we'll use the second LFO for its volume. We'll just assign this like this for now, and then we'll worry about the shape later. The third LFO will be a little bit more like open, and this is going to be for the noise. What you can do here is, if you want the transient to be clean, do something like this. And again, we can choose the noise type that we want. I'm going to again go for the bright white because I just really like the way that sounds on these kind of drums. One of the interesting things that I didn't talk about yet, but which you can potentially do, is to put a filter on the noise and then use some of these combs or the flangers or whatever. You have those ones that you can sweep in however you want. Usually I'll use the plus, and then I'll up this a little bit and maybe get something like this. Maybe a little bit less drive. And now we have this. Now obviously that sounds nothing like a snare that we would use, so let's fix that a little bit. We're already getting closer, but you're not going to get the real tone just from this page. Where you're going to get the real tone from is from the distortion. And the way that I like to think of it is it's going to take this sine wave and this noise, going to put it together, and then because it's going to be pushed into a distortion unit, into a non-linearity, they will start to modulate each other while they're distorting. And you get this very crispy sound out of that because the sine wave is pushing the noise into the distortion at the peaks here. Whereas here in the middle, it has a lot more space to work with just for the noise. So that's where you get this crispy effect from. Obviously, we have to make sure that the levels are set correctly. And one of the things that we can do to get a little bit of extra transient, in this case, I want a little bit of extra snap here, is to take a fourth LFO, and we're just going to assign that to the master pitch here. You can hear what kind of snap that gives if I turn it off with a macro. But again, it sounds very, very boring, so we're going to do a little bit of post-processing. We're just going to make it stereo again using the dimension, and again with the reverb trick. We can use LFO5 for our reverb here, and we're just going to make sure that it doesn't have any in the transient, and then we'll kind of leave it ringing out like this. But what I'm really missing is a little bit of extra brightness and a little bit of extra air. So we're just going to use an EQ here. Let's set this to 10K-ish and then boost this up. I would like to get a little bit more snap here in the higher frequency. So we're again using an LFO here. Just make the shape that we want for this particular modulation. Maybe we can slightly duck its frequency as well so that it affects a little bit of a stronger area. And we can lower the Q as well so that it has effect more as we're smoothing out this point a little bit more. And now you can hear we have something of a snare. Now within Psytrance, the snares that I showed you before, you saw that they did have a fundamental as I initially imported them, but I cut them out at some point for all of them. So it's a good idea when listening to your snares to have a quick listen to it without that fundamental in there, to just hear what it would sound like if it was used in, you know, a normal Psytrance way. But I would say here that it's maybe a little bit too sustained. So we're just going to slightly lower this and we're going to bring this down here. Let's have a listen to what this sounds like. I like that. It's just a little bit too strong on the fundamental here. And you can hear that with a little bit of extra EQing, we have a nice snare sound. And then obviously, again, you're going to record it so that you can check the waveform. And in this case, we have something like this. For heads, there's really two viable ways of doing it. Again, we can use a different type of noise in here and then use some kind of filter on it to add the texture that you want in the higher frequencies. So we're going to go noise here. I am just setting this a little bit higher to get some nice texture there. Maybe actually let's go with one of these plus ones so that we can remove that mess in the lowest frequencies and we just get something like this. Now we just set an amp envelope for open heads. We're going to do something like this. Maybe a little bit shorter. Let's zoom in a little bit here so we have a little bit better way to work it. Obviously, we can EQ this. This is the first way to do it. This actually is going to work in every synth. And the other way that I'm going to show you only really works in Serum, because Serum, when you go into the noise oscillator here in the, I believe, again, the organics maybe? Yeah, we have this cymbal loop here. And this just sounds like a cymbal already. So all you have to do here is to set up just something like this. And now you have, for example, a closed hat, or you could do it like this with an open hat. And again, you would need to EQ and process this in some kind of way to make it actually sound decent. Now, those are all of your main drums. I can sit here and explain to you a whole bunch of different ways of doing percussions and rides and crashes, and it's all going to come down to the same thing. You kind of have to imagine what the drum is going to do when it comes to the envelopes and all of the modulations that are on there. And a good way to train yourself is A, to just do it a couple of times, and B, is to use a different sample pack, one that you like. For example, I use Psychedelic Intelligence, and I just went through and looked at some of the waveforms. What do they look like? What are they doing? How are they made up in terms of frequency content and stuff like that? And once you have that down, you can start to think of all of the processes that you need to actually reproduce sounds like that. So that's everything that I wanted to talk about. Again, I can make this video as long as I want. I can continue talking for another couple of hours about this kind of synthesis. But there's really not much more through it than just kind of imagining, okay, what do I want the drum to do? Especially with something like percussions, in which you have a little bit more liberty to go away from kind of like a standard. Usually for something like a clap or a snare or a hat, there's a real good solid standard that works, and anything that kind of falls outside of that sounds immediately a little bit off to us. Because obviously those original drums are somewhat linked to a drum set, and a drum set just has a particular type of sound that has to be respected in some way for it to actually sound natural. But I found that specifically for percussions, there's a little bit more liberty in terms of making the sound a little bit more unique. That does actually mean that there isn't actually one way that I can show you how to make all of the different percussions that I'm using. There were a lot of techniques involved in making the percussions for the pack. Maybe at some point I will do a separate video on percussion making. Maybe I'll just talk about a few of the techniques if you guys are interested in that. Let me know by leaving a comment if you are interested. If you enjoyed the video for today, make sure that you liked it. And if you're new here, make sure that you're subscribed. But this is going to be the video for now. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.
How much we allow our past experiences to